Okay, welcome back. Today we are going to talk about chemistry. I know it's nobody's favorite subject, but we have to have a certain understanding of chemistry and physics for that matter to really get a deeper understanding for how the human body works. So make sure before you watch this video that you've watched the two basic chem review videos from the Penguin Prof. She goes over the basics of atoms and the periodic table and chemical bonds. So make sure that you have those down. That is all covered in the first portion of Chapter 2. I'm going to pick up about halfway through with water. So here is our comic about our polar bear dissolving in water. And the brown bear is saying, "Oh, you're not soluble." And he says, "No, that's easy for you to say. You're not polar." So hopefully that makes sense to you. If not, you need to go back and watch those review videos so we know that anything that is polar is going to interact well with water because of those hydrogen bonds that you learned about. So, ha ha ha, funny comic. So let's talk about water. You are mainly water, so water is going to play a huge role in how your body is going to work. So we're going to look at some of the properties of water that make it so special. The first is solvency. Water is what's called the universal solvent, and that is because its polar nature. So we know that our water molecule here is going to have a partial negative charge over by the oxygen end and partial positive charges over here at the hydrogen ends. And so this is going to create polarity. Now, when water interacts with something like sodium chloride, so you should remember sodium chloride is being held together by ionic bonds. Water can easily dissolve sodium chloride. You put salt in water, shake it up a little bit, and the sodium chloride dissolves or ionizes into the water. The reason that water can overcome the attraction between the sodium and the chloride is that it can surround each of these ions in what's called a sphere of hydration. The way it does this is by orientating the water molecule so that this sodium is going to be attracted to the partial negatives of all of those oxygens facing it. And this negatively charged chloride is going to be attracted to all of those positive partial charges that are facing it. So you can see that the water can orientate itself in two different ways in order to break up the electrical attraction between the sodium and the chloride. So water is going to be able to dissolve anything that is what's called hydrophilic. So hydro means water, philic means loving. So anything that is charged or polar will be able to dissolve in water. Hydrophobic or water-fearing substances, which are lipids, are not going to be dissolved in water. So oil and water, they don't mix. Okay, so if it's hydrophilic, we're going to be able to dissolve it. If it's hydrophobic, doesn't matter how much water we put in there, it's not going to dissolve. All right, water has two properties, adhesion and cohesion, that are important in the human body. Adhesion is the property of water sticking to other molecules. This comes into play in our serous membranes, where you have a thin film of water between two sheets of tissue. The water adhering to both of those sheets allows things like your lungs and your heart to be in constant movement next to each other, but not be rubbing against each other and creating friction. Cohesion is the property of water molecules wanting to bind to each other. This is particularly important in terms of something we have to overcome in your lungs. So when you are consistently making sure that the deepest portion of your lungs, the alveoli, are inflated, it's to overcome the cohesive nature of water. If the water molecules had their way, the alveoli, the walls, would be touching each other instead of being inflated because those molecules want to hang out with each other because water is cohesive. So we'll see the properties of adhesion and cohesion coming into play multiple times. Water is reactive in that it can form ions, like we've seen here with our spheres of hydration, but water itself can ionize. So when water ionizes, you're going to get a hydrogen ion and a hydroxide ion. So you've got an H and an OH. The H is positively charged, the hydroxide ion is negatively charged, and so there's a lot of reactivity. Almost all of our chemical reactions will occur with water in the human body because we are mostly water. And then lastly, it's very thermally stable. And what this means is that it takes a great deal of energy to change the temperature of water. So in terms of homeostasis, that's really important. When you think about the amount of energy that it takes to actually increase the temperature of the water in your body, that's what allows us to be incredibly stable. It can get really, really hot outside, but we don't change our internal temperature. It's also, so that's what's called a high heat capacity, that it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature. It's also got a high heat of vaporization, which makes it an effective coolant. So when you sweat, in order to take the water in your sweat from the liquid to the gas state, that also takes a huge amount of energy in the form of heat out of your body. So water is incredibly stable, and that's going to maintain our homeostasis. We will talk about water over and over and over and over again as we go through the human body here. Now, acids, bases, and pHs, something we also need to definitely pay attention to. So we're not going to go deep into this. This is anatomy and physiology, not chemistry. So for our purposes, acids release hydrogen ions. Bases accept them or bind them up. So that's good enough for us. pH is the measure of the concentration of free hydrogen ions. So only free hydrogen ions. So not ones that are bound up in water or anything like that. Free hydrogen ions is what we're measuring when we talk about pH. So you've seen a pH scale before. We know that pH of 7 is neutral. So what that means is you have equal hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. As your pH number decreases, okay, so going from 7 to 6 to 5 to 4, you are increasing the amount of hydrogen. As your pH number increases, going from 7 to 8 to 9 to 10 to 11, you are going lower in terms of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So you want to make sure that you understand that inverse relationship. As pH number goes down, hydrogen ion goes up. Okay? As pH number goes up, hydrogen ion goes down. So one of the major things we'll talk about is the pH of blood, because that's basically what we would call the pH of your body, aside from certain specific areas. And it is somewhere between 7.35 and 7.45, so we'll call it 7.4 here. You can see your gastric juice, so your stomach juice, is pH of 2. We've got some different pH environments in here. Now, it's not good for the body to have huge swings in pH. Maintaining the homeostatic range of pH is a huge deal for your body. When you go outside of that range, you fall into pathology very quickly, and it's not that far out that you die. So human life, pH, somewhere between 6.8 and 8. But once you get into, 7.3 or 7.5, you're starting to see the effects in your body. That's something we'll get into when we talk about the homeostasis chapter in the second half of anatomy. But we expend a huge amount of energy making sure that our pH stays in the homeostatic range. One of the things that's going to help us with that is that we have multiple buffer systems. If you've ever been in a chem lab, you know what a buffer is. It's a chemical that resists the change in pH. So let's say you've got a solution in a beaker and you put a buffer in it. Okay, you can add hydrogen and the pH doesn't change. You could add hydroxide and the pH doesn't change. So buffers are going to resist the change in pH. That's what's going to help us maintain our homeostatic range, is that we have multiple chemical and multiple physical buffering systems. Again, that's something that we'll talk about toward the end of 252. So last thing to look at here in this first topic is going to be chemical reactions. So we're going to look at the different types of reactions, which direction they proceed, and what's going to affect how quickly they're going to occur. So first of all, basically we have three different types of reactions. We have what are called decomposition reactions, synthesis reactions, and exchange reactions. All of these are going to fall into one of two categories: catabolic or anabolic. So catabolic reactions are going to break something down. You're going from large to small. You're going from a polymer to a monomer. Anabolic are going to build things up. You're going from small to large. You're going from monomers to polymers. Catabolic and anabolic reactions, when you add them together, are what is termed metabolism. So all of the catabolic plus all of the anabolic reactions in your body, that is what equals your metabolism, or the sum of all chemical reactions in a cell or an organism. When looking at these types of reactions, we can also look at them from an energy perspective. So all chemical reactions require energy. They are either requiring you to put energy in, or you are getting energy out. Catabolic reactions. These are decomposition reactions. You've got a molecule, so here's starch. This is what makes carbs delicious. And what it is a branched polymer of thousands of glucose molecules. So when you break these bonds to form the individual glucose molecules, you are going to release the energy that is stored in those bonds. Therefore, catabolic or decomposition reactions are what are termed exergonic. They release energy. Anabolic reactions, which are synthesis reactions, you're going to take your individual subunits or your monomers and you're going to link them together. You're going to form chemical bonds. This is going to require that you input energy. So anabolic reactions or synthesis reactions are endergonic. So you can look at it in terms of, are you building up or breaking down? And you can look at it in terms of the energy in versus energy out. The third type of reaction combines the previous two. It's called an exchange reaction. So you're going to break a bond and form a bond. So you're going to rearrange basically the bonds in these molecules and end up with two different molecules. So you start with AB and CD and you end up with AC and BD. So this is just a combination of a decomposition and a synthesis reaction. Now, the direction of a reaction. Many of the reactions in the human body are reversible, meaning that I could break this starch molecule down, or I could form a bunch of bonds and form it back. I could form a protein or break it down into individual amino acids. When you have a reversible reaction, it's all about trying to get to equilibrium. Everything in nature wants to go to your lowest possible energy state, and that's going to be equilibrium. So if you have a lot of reactants and not a lot of products, it's going to push your equation in the forward direction. If you've got a lot of products and not a lot of reactants, it's going to push it in the backwards direction. So direction has to do with reaching equilibrium. Now, the other thing we want to look at is the rates of a reaction, how quickly we proceed toward equilibrium. The concentration of the reactants and products will play into this. So if you have a very significant difference between the two concentrations, then it's going to push the reaction faster. The temperature is going to play a big role here. So again, if you've been in a chem lab at some point in your life, you know that you don't just stand there with a beaker. Your beaker is almost always on a hot plate. Heat is energy. When you add energy into the system, it's going to make those molecules move around faster, and everything's going to proceed faster. And then lastly would be your catalysts. And in terms of the human body, catalysts are enzymes. These are things that help the reaction proceed faster. So all of those will come into play in terms of how quickly our reactions are going to proceed. Another type of reaction that we will see actually in our next chapter when we talk about energy synthesis in cells is oxidation reduction or redox reactions. So these have to do with the movement of electrons. So your electron donors are going to lose their electrons and they are going to be oxidized in these reactions. Your electron acceptors are going to receive those electrons and they will become reduced. So whenever something has the electrons, it's reduced, and then as it loses them, it becomes oxidized. Whatever doesn't have the electrons and it gains them, that is being reduced. Okay, so these are always combined together. We can't just throw electrons out into the universe and hoping for the best. We always have to give them to something. So a donor has to have a receiver. Couple ways to remember this. Leo the Lion says grr, oil rig, whatever works for you. Okay, but basically cellular respiration that we're going to study in the next chapter is going to be a giant redox reaction. So you want to make sure that you understand what's being oxidized, what's being reduced, and how the electrons are moving. Okay, so here we can just kind of like sum up the energy transfer in these chemical reactions. So anything, remember, that is exergonic is releasing energy. So oxidation, decomposition, catabolic, okay, all of those would fall under exergonic. Endergonic means that you have to put energy in, so your reduction, your synthesis, your anabolic reactions. So we will come across different chemical reactions as we go through the body. It's not a chem class, but you do need to understand the basics.